The forest, deep in its shade, had a way of swallowing the sound of movement. A sudden hush, then the creaking of dry branches as if the trees themselves had held their breath. The sunlight was angled low, turning the pine needles into a glimmering gold, while shadows stretched longer than they should have. And there nestled between the underbrush a flash of orange, a piece of fabric caught on a rock. It was a small thing, too ordinary at first glance to be anything out of place, but there was something about it. The stillness around it, that unmistakable quiet that settles before something irrevocable happens. The air had thickened heavy with the weight of time waiting for its answer. As I stepped closer, the smell hit me, damp earth and something else, something sour stuck in the back of my throat. I froze, then slowly knelt, brushing away branches to see a body twisted in an unnatural way, wrapped tightly in its own tent. The knots in the ropes were deliberate, methodical. It was a scene I couldn't erase. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. The year was 2010, and the valley was already dry under the summer sun. The Shasta Trinity National Forest, a place that held a certain kind of silence, always seemed a little too still in the summer. The temperature hung heavy over the land dust, settling on the trails that were once fresh with morning dew. It was the sort of place you could get lost in, and most people who wandered here, well, they didn't really wander. They had a purpose. They were there to find something, whether it was a peak, a stream, or just a few days away from the world. Jaden Glenn was one of those people who felt at home in the forest, though in a way he'd always been a bit of an outsider. He was a young man just 26 from Sacramento, and his life was one that revolved around facts, figures, and quiet moments in the woods. He didn't mind being alone in the silence. He embraced it. As a biology student with a love for studying wildlife, the Shasta Trinity was more than just a landscape to him. It was a living laboratory, a place where he could observe and document life as it happened, untouched by the rush of city life. His trip that June was no different from any other. He planned to study the black-tailed deer, those elusive creatures that moved quietly through the undergrowth. He'd been on solo trips before, his gear always neatly packed, his route always carefully plotted. Alice, his mother, had raised him alone. She knew the woods didn't scare him. He knew how to read the land, how to find his way even in the thickest fog or the densest patches of trees. She could hear it in his voice the day before he left, calm, confident. "I'm prepared, Mom," he'd said, reassuring her. "Everything's checked, map, compass, water. Don't worry." And for a mother who had always worried, it was as if that one conversation set her at ease. She trusted him. Redding was a small town, quiet at least during the summer months when the tourists trickled in and out. There was something about the area's rhythm that felt timeless, like nothing ever truly changed. People drove the same roads, parked in the same spots, and walked the same trails. As routine as the morning fog that would roll through in the early hours, the forest would stand still and expect the same regular people to pass through. Jaden had always been meticulous. His backpack stuffed with essentials, a tent, a sleeping bag, a camera trap, binoculars was prepared with care. He wasn't the type to make rash decisions. He knew the weight of every item, the journey he'd planned, and the animals he would observe. The day he left, he stopped at the gas station for fuel, 2 bottles of water, and a handful of candy bars. Just a small exchange, something as normal as the quiet hum of the gas pump. A moment captured on camera, his smiling face bright as he spoke briefly with the cashier. The kind of scene that might be replayed 1,000 times in 100 stories, ordinary, almost too perfect to be anything but. But then that was the last anyone saw of him. For Alice, the first inkling that something was wrong came quietly. Jaden's 3-day trip passed without a word, and she shrugged it off, as most mothers would. But then the 4th day came and went, and she started to call. By the 5th day, the unease gnawed at her like a slow burn. She called the park office. She spoke to the rangers, who at first assured her it was nothing out of the ordinary. A few days late, nothing more. But as the sun dipped low that evening, a sense of finality began to creep in, as if she could feel that the forest had already made its choice. The search didn't start until 5 days later. By then, the quiet spaces between the trees had already grown deeper, darker, and Alice's calm voice on the other end of the phone felt more like a whisper on the wind. The search teams, local volunteers, and park rangers spread out in the thick shaded woods where even the air felt dense, holding its breath, waiting for a sign. But the days stretched on. The trail grew colder. A few boot prints near a stream, the faintest signs that he had been there, but nothing to tell them where Jaden had gone or why he hadn't come back. The quiet continued to spread across the valley, too heavy to ignore. And then, when the 7th day came with no new leads, the rangers officially suspended the search. The area had been scoured and no one knew what had happened to Jaden. Alice didn't believe it. Not for a moment. There was no way her son had just vanished like that. But the forest, its silence, its stillness, held its own secrets. It would take more than the sun's fading light or the wind in the trees to stir up the truth. It would take something far quieter. And it wouldn't come from the people searching for him. Not yet. I still remember the phone call I got from Alice on the 5th day after Jaden was supposed to have returned from his trip to the forest. There was a slight tremor in her voice, but she didn't outright say anything was wrong. She just kept asking about the rangers if they'd found anything. I tried to reassure her, said it was nothing to worry about, that hikers sometimes get delayed, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't let me breathe easy. It's funny how you can feel the shift in the air before you even see the storm, like a heavy silence that hangs in the room and doesn't leave until it's time to face what you've been dreading. The first signs of something being wrong were small, almost unnoticeable. A few phone calls, a couple of messages left unanswered, nothing that would have set off alarm bells on its own. I know now, looking back, that it was those little moments, the things you'd shrug off, thinking nothing of them, that really should have been the warning. I tried not to dwell on it. The world keeps moving after all, and there was no reason to panic yet. But as the days crept on, Alice's worry turned into something else, an unease that couldn't be shaken, even when she kept telling herself it was just a delay, that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The rangers weren't too concerned at first. A few days late, nothing to fret about, they said. They assured her it wasn't uncommon for hikers to lose track of time, or even for the forest to make a person lose track of themselves for a bit. But 5 days stretched into 6, and by the 7th day, that reassurance started to wear thin. Alice was already at the park office by then, and I'll never forget the way she sounded when she called me asking me to meet her at the ranger station. There was no bravado left in her voice, just a quiet edge of something that didn't quite belong in a mother's words. I could hear her moving in the background when I got there. There was a clink of keys, a brief shuffling sound like someone shifting papers. It wasn't her usual routine. She was usually calm, practical, but not that day. She was pacing. Her fingers were drumming on the counter. I could almost hear them tapping out the beats of her anxiety. When I walked in, she just looked up at me, her face pale in the dim gray light of the ranger station, eyes wide too bright. It was like she was waiting for someone to confirm what she didn't want to know. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me the paper that the rangers had filed, a simple log, nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. But I could see it in her eyes, something was terribly wrong. We weren't the only ones who'd started to wonder. The park staff had made a few calls, organized a small search effort, but there was nothing. Not a single sign. Not a hint of where Jaden might have gone, what might have happened. Not even his backpack, his tent. No trace at all. They found his car untouched, parked just like it was supposed to be, no signs of a struggle or anything out of the ordinary. His phone was inside dead. That's when the rangers started to change their tune, but by then it was too late. I remember the dust in the air as we walked those trails, the sun high and harsh overhead. The ground was dry, the kind of dry that makes everything feel brittle, like 100 little cracks just waiting to break wide open. The forest around us seemed like a living thing, breathing in rhythm with the wind, as if it was watching us, waiting for us to leave. We spent hours walking in silence, calling out Jaden's name. The silence of the woods was thick, pressing in on us like it knew something we didn't. Every now and then we'd hear the distant sound of a bird calling or a branch snapping underfoot, but nothing ever came back to us. As the hours wore on, we found a few clues: boot prints by a stream, a small wrapper from an energy bar. Nothing concrete, nothing that connected to Jaden, but it was enough to keep us moving, to keep the hope flickering. Hope has a way of making you push forward, even when the forest itself seems to be telling you to turn back. But it was just us, now the volunteers, a few rangers, some dog handlers. The official search hadn't started yet, and there was a part of me that still thought this might just be a misunderstanding, a mix-up, a temporary thing. By the end of the first day, we had found nothing, no sign of him anywhere. I went back to the parking lot that evening and looked at the spot where Jaden's car had been parked. It still sat there empty the same way it had been when we first arrived. The air had turned cooler, and the faint smell of pine mixed with something else, something thick, a little bitter, that settled in the back of my throat as I stood there. There was a sense of finality in the silence, something almost too quiet. It wasn't right. I don't know how else to describe it, but the world had shifted and we hadn't noticed, and that's when the thought finally hit me. What if he wasn't coming back? Alice stayed behind after I left, still talking to the rangers. I didn't have to say it aloud, but we both knew the truth was beginning to settle in. The first signs of fear that morning had been small, almost imperceptible, just a missed call here, a delay there. But now, as the evening settled and the sun dipped below the horizon, those signs were beginning to add up, weaving a story we didn't want to believe. That night, I went home. The house was still and quiet, too quiet, with the kind of heavy silence that feels unnatural. It was the kind of night where you can't help but think about the things you can't see. The kind of night where the air feels thick with things unsaid, secrets buried just beneath the surface. I knew deep down that we weren't dealing with a simple misunderstanding anymore. We were dealing with something else, something we hadn't even begun to understand. And as the evening stretched on, I couldn't help but think about that one image that had started to haunt me. Jaden's car sitting there, the door shut tight, the engine cold, the silence too thick to break. The next morning, Alice was back at the ranger station. We hadn't heard from Jaden, not a word. There was no sign of him, not even a hint of what might have happened. It was as if the forest had just taken him and no one had seen it happen. I knew it was only a matter of time before the official search was called. But before that happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something I couldn't place. The sun had set by the time I saw the headlights pull into Alice's driveway. There was a moment of stillness before the deputy stepped out, his hat in hand. It was too late and everyone knew it. The forest had grown quiet again, but this time it was different. The morning the official search began, the air had that thin, pale light that comes just before the heat settles in. I remember standing on the gravel outside the ranger station, feeling the crunch under my boots, watching deputies step out of their cruisers one by one. Their radios were already crackling with early chatter, that low, static hum that always precedes something serious. A line of Forest Service trucks pulled in behind them, dust drifting in slow spirals around their tires. That was the moment it truly hit me. This wasn't just a late hiker anymore. This had become something larger, something that required maps grids, and the quiet determination of people who understood how quickly the woods could swallow a man whole. Alice stood off to the side, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the day. She wasn't crying, she'd passed that stage, but her shoulders had that slight, rigid tilt that told me she was barely holding herself together. A ranger walked over with a clipboard, asked her routine questions. When did she last hear from him? What gear did he take? Did he ever stray from his planned routes? I watched her answer, her voice soft, almost apologetic, as though she feared saying the wrong thing might somehow push him deeper into the forest. The ranger nodded, made notes, then stepped away. It was the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times before. By mid-morning, we were out on the trail. The dogs were already pacing, noses low, tails stiff with focus. Their handlers spoke to them in that calm, steady tone meant to keep them working. I walked behind the group, the smell of pine and dust filling the air, the same earthy scent that always rises when the sun starts warming the forest floor. I called out Jaden's name more times than I can remember, my voice echoing off the slopes before dissolving into the quiet. It's strange the way sound behaves out there. Sometimes it travels far. Other times it dies the moment it leaves your mouth, as though the trees absorb it. We found the first set of footprints along a shallow stream, prints about the right size heading north. The mud had dried around the edges, cracked like old pottery. One of the deputies crouched down, brushed the dirt lightly with his glove, and shook his head. "Not recent," he said quietly. The scent dogs picked up on something for a moment, pulling forward with eager energy, only to lose it just 100 yards later. They circled confused, their noses lifting into the breeze as though searching for a thread that had snapped. I could feel the hope in the group dimming little by little like embers cooling under ash. We moved farther in, deeper than most tourists ever go. The trail narrowed and the brush grew thicker. Every so often we'd stop and listen, straining for any sign, water shifting over rocks, a distant branch snapping, maybe even a voice. But the forest gave us nothing, just the rustle of dry grass beneath our boots and the faint rattle of radio clips on deputy vests. At one point we reached a clearing that looked like it might have been used as a camp. A few stones arranged in a half circle, a patch of flattened grass. For a heartbeat I thought we'd found something meaningful. But the rangers recognized it, old, long abandoned. "Seen this one before," one of them said. "Kids camped here months back." We kept moving. By the second afternoon, a helicopter droned overhead, chopping through the stillness with those deep rhythmic pulses you can feel in your chest. I watched its shadow slide across the treetops, stretching and shrinking with the lay of the land. The pilot radioed down that visibility was poor in some of the ravines, dense canopy blocking the view. It was frustrating, but not surprising. There were pockets of those woods that sunlight barely touched even on the brightest days, places where you could stand in daylight and still feel like you were inside a cathedral of shadows. Search teams broke into smaller groups, fanning out. Volunteers hiked with brightly colored packs, their water bottles clinking, their radios giving off the occasional burst of static. I'd catch glimpses of them between the trees, splashes of red, orange, yellow moving methodically through the green. Every so often we'd meet up on some ridge or wide stretch of trail to compare notes. The conversations grew shorter as the hours wore on, voices, tired eyes, scanning the map spread across the hood of a sheriff's truck. Deputy Harlan drew small X's on the grid with a dry erase marker, his hand steady but his expression tight. "Clear," he'd say, marking another section. Nothing. That word hung heavier each time. Rumors began trickling through the crews. A hunter claimed he'd heard shots earlier in the summer near the upper trails. A couple from Oregon mentioned strange machinery noises echoing late at night on their last visit. A few locals who knew the area well muttered about illegal operations tucked deep among the slopes, old stories that surfaced whenever someone went missing. I'd heard versions of those tales before, years back when I was still with the sheriff's office. They always came up in moments like this, half whispers passed from one tired volunteer to the next. Folks don't like to admit it, but forests, especially ones as vast as Shasta Trinity, tend to attract people who want to stay unnoticed. Still, none of us wanted to jump to conclusions. We had nothing to go on, except the slightest scraps. A wrapper by a log that could have been anyone's. A fabric scrap caught on a thorn that didn't match what Jaden packed. A faint scent trail the dogs couldn't hold on to. And every time something didn't fit, you could feel the whole group sag a little more, like we were trying to carry a weight that kept growing heavier. By the third day of searching, fatigue had settled deep into everyone's bones. The air felt dry, metallic almost, and every exhale came out warm enough to stir the dust at our feet. Alice stayed close to the base camp, refusing to leave. She talked to the rangers each time they returned, her hands twisting slightly at the hem of her shirt, her voice low, steady, but frayed at the edges. I walked over to her at one point, handed her a bottle of cold water. She thanked me with a small nod, the corners of her eyes tightening the way they do when a person's trying very hard not to fall apart. The rangers worked with a precision that only comes from experience. They combed the ravines with ropes and harnesses, moving slowly, calling out now and then. The deeper gullies were filled with thick, stagnant air pockets of cool dampness that seeped through the seams of your boots. Each time a team climbed out, their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, their expressions fixed somewhere between determination and dread. We all knew time was slipping by, and whatever chance we might have had of finding him unharmed was fading with every hour. There was one moment I still carry with me. Late afternoon sun slanting low through the trees, painting everything in that golden haze that comes just before dusk. We'd paused on a ridge listening to the rustle of wind moving through the branches. One of the scent dogs, an older chocolate lab, lifted his head, suddenly ears pricked. He stood very still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a split second, every person nearby froze as if the world itself had paused. But then, the dog let out a low whine, tail dropping, and turned away. Whatever he'd sensed, it vanished as quickly as it came. The silence afterward felt heavy, almost accusatory. People in town started to talk. I'd hear murmurs in the grocery store, on the sidewalk outside the diner, at the gas station where Jaden had been seen on that last morning. Some folks thought he'd wandered too far off trail. Others blamed the heat. A few brought up darker theories, speaking in hushed tones, as though afraid the forest might hear them. I'd been around long enough to know this pattern, the uncertainty, the speculation, the grasping for something solid when all you had was the wide-open unknown. When night fell each evening, the base camp took on an eerie stillness. Lanterns cast warm halos across the dirt, casting shadows that flickered against tents and trucks. Volunteers sat on overturned buckets, rubbing tired legs, sipping lukewarm coffee. Radios squawked with status updates, each one sounding more hollow than the last. The forest around us felt vast, endless, an ocean of trees shifting quietly in the darkness. By the end of the fourth day, we'd covered more ground than I could have imagined, miles of trail, slope, brush, ravine. And yet not one piece of evidence truly belonged to Jaden, not one clue that pointed firmly in any direction. It was like he'd stepped off the trail and dissolved into the air, leaving behind nothing but the vaguest impressions of a passage. That night I stood near the edge of camp, looking out into the tree line. The sky was dimming to a deep blue, the last light catching on the tops of the pines. A kind of hush settled over everything, the sort of hush that makes your pulse slow, your breath shallow. I'd been in that forest countless times before, but never had it looked quite like that, still watchful, almost expectant. Then a sharp burst of static came from the camp radio behind me. A deputy's voice cut through, low and controlled. "We've got something," he said. Just 3 words. I turned as he walked toward us, something small held carefully in his glove. His expression was unreadable, but the way he approached, slow, deliberate, made the hairs on my arms lift. Whatever he had found, it wasn't nothing. And for the first time since the search began, the air around us felt different, as though the forest had finally decided to let something surface. It was late in the afternoon when it happened. The air had turned thin and dry, that kind of dryness that seeps into your skin and makes you aware of every breath you take. I had just finished walking another stretch of trail when the call came over the radio. It wasn't the usual static or routine chatter that I'd grown used to hearing by then. This was different, urgent, sharp. I could hear the tension crackling through the speaker before the words even registered. "We've got something," came the voice, a deputy's, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. It wasn't a sound I'd ever hoped to hear, but I knew what it meant. The search, the uncertainty, The endless days of hoping those were all over. Something had been found. For a split second, my heart dropped, but I didn't know why. I couldn't let myself know why. Not yet. I moved toward the source of the voice past the huddled searchers, all of them stiffening as they heard the radio call. A deputy was already marking off a section of the trail, his hand waving people back, his voice low but insistent. "Keep clear, everyone. Keep clear. We're marking off this area now." I could feel the tension ripple through the group, the shift in atmosphere that only comes when the game has changed. The air grew heavier somehow, and the hum of radios in the background made everything feel distant. I stepped forward, my boots shifting gravel beneath me as the silence began to stretch out my breath, coming a little faster. I hadn't expected this, not yet. Not after days of nothing. The closer I got, the more the air felt like it had been sucked out of the space, like the weight of what we were about to uncover had already begun to settle over us. We were near the edge of a ravine, a place where the trees clustered thick and heavy, and the ground below was soft, overgrown with brambles. The last time I'd been here, the area had been nothing but a mess of fallen branches and underbrush. But now, as the deputies moved aside and cleared the area, I saw it the faintest orange through the trees, a flash of color that shouldn't have been there. I wasn't sure at first if it was the shape of a tent or just the remains of a campfire, but as I got closer, it became clear. The fabric was unmistakable. It was Jaden's tent, tightly wrapped in ropes, twisted and bound like something intentionally hidden. My chest tightened, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet shift even though I wasn't moving. My body knew what my mind refused to fully accept. The group stood back, their faces drawn tight with the kind of exhaustion that comes after too many dead ends. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the ground. We all just stood there for a moment, taking it in before the ranger moved in with measured steps, gloves on, flashlight flickering in his hand. The first few seconds were the longest of my life. The silence felt as thick as the forest itself, and I could almost hear the heartbeat in my ears, a steady thrum that echoed the moment. As the ranger carefully sliced through the ropes, the body inside was revealed still curled in a fetal position, tucked in against the cold, wrapped too tightly for comfort. The sight of it hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe for a moment, couldn't process what I was seeing. The fabric was damp, clinging to the remains, the body's outline still strangely intact despite the length of time. It looked like a ghost tucked away in a cocoon waiting to be set free, but there was nothing freeing about it. Nothing peaceful. The body's skin had already begun to darken, and I could smell the faintest tinge of decay that mixed with the earth, the pine, the sweat on our skin. It was the kind of smell that makes your stomach turn even when you don't want it to. The others hadn't moved either. No one said anything for a long time, as if speech itself might shatter the heavy quiet. The ranger bent down carefully, adjusting the ropes around the body, revealing the metal watch on the wrist. I recognized it immediately. Jaden's graduation gift, a token Alice had given him when he'd graduated college. That little piece of metal had more weight to it now than any of us could have expected. We all knew what this meant. There was no question anymore. I stepped closer, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. My legs felt like they might buckle, but I refused to let myself falter. It wasn't a surprise, not really, not when you've seen enough. But seeing it unfold before you, seeing it with your own eyes, it always leaves something behind. Something you can't erase. The body was cold, frozen, in a position that seemed too unnatural, too deliberate. My gaze lingered for a moment, and then I forced myself to look away. I knew what we had to do next. One of the deputies radioed in for backup, and within minutes, a team was on the way to secure the site. The rest of us stepped back, trying to keep the area clear. There was nothing else we could do. The forest that had kept its secret for so long had finally let go, but now we were left with the weight of that secret, and it felt heavier than anything we could carry. The body was carefully covered, and the site was roped off. I could hear the sound of the forensics team arriving in the distance, their footsteps crunching over the leaves, the whine of radios still echoing in the background. It wasn't until later that I realized what had happened. Jaden hadn't just wandered off. He hadn't gotten lost. This wasn't a story about a young man who had gotten too far off the trail. This was a story about a young man who had been watched, who had been followed. A man who had been killed not out of malice but out of fear of being caught. It wasn't some random act. It wasn't an accident. This was premeditated. And the forest which had hidden him so well had finally given up its secret, but not without a cost. We stood there for a while, letting it all settle in. The rangers moved in with their usual professional calm, securing the scene. Alice was still at the base camp waiting. I didn't want to tell her yet. I couldn't. Not until everything was certain, not until we could get the answers we needed. But I could already see the weight of it in her face, even from a distance. She knew. We all knew. The site was secured and the body was removed with the care that only comes with experience. The quiet that followed felt more suffocating than the silence before. The night stretched long, filled with the sounds of a world that had stopped spinning, waiting for something to break the stillness. But there would be no more waiting. Not anymore. The next few hours blurred together, talk of evidence, photographs, reports. But all I could focus on was that small, cold body wrapped in a tent. It was the last piece of the puzzle. It had always been there, hidden under layers of dirt, of time, of lies. And now it had been uncovered. The truth was finally in the open. And yet there was no relief. Just a deep, empty ache. A reminder that some things, some truths are far too heavy to ever let go. I don't remember much of the ride back to the sheriff's office. I only remember the quiet, the hum of the cruiser's engine, the red and blue lights flickering in the rearview mirror. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions. But tonight, we had something more important to face. The truth, as terrible as it was, had finally come to light. But it wouldn't be over. Not by a long shot. Not yet. The days after Jaden's body was found moved slower than anything I'd experienced before. The weight of what we'd uncovered was like something pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It didn't matter how many reports I had to file, how many phone calls I had to make. The truth had already settled in my bones, and I didn't know how to shake it. The entire community felt the shift, though it took a while for it to fully sink in. It wasn't just the disappearance anymore. It was the discovery. The awful, undeniable fact that someone had taken a life and the forest had hidden it all this time. Law enforcement moved quickly after that. The scene was sealed off, a perimeter set up around the ravine, and forensic teams came in like clockwork. They worked through the evening, cataloging evidence, taking photographs, and marking down every detail. The process seemed mechanical, but I could see the fatigue in their faces. Some things, no matter how many times you do them, don't ever get easier. I stayed at the edge of the camp as they worked the quiet weight of everything pressing on me, while Alice was still at the base camp, just waiting. I couldn't bring myself to talk to her then. There were too many things I couldn't say. People started to hear the news. It spread quickly through the small town. People whispered, the older folks exchanging their theories, some thinking the forest had swallowed him up, some saying the land had a way of making people vanish. But this wasn't just about some vague mystery anymore. This was real. Jaden was gone. There was no way to make sense of it all yet, but there was no denying the truth. The following days were a blur of paperwork interviews and more waiting. Alice's face never lost the tight, strained look as she tried to hold herself together. She had spent every minute searching, every moment praying for Jaden's return. But now the hope was gone. She didn't need anyone to tell her what had happened. She'd known the moment she saw the authorities surrounding that ravine. Her son was never coming back. The detectives worked their angles, connecting dots in a way that didn't bring comfort but rather more questions. When they arrested the Garrett brothers, I felt a quiet kind of relief, but it was hollow. The feeling wasn't justice, it was simply the truth coming to light as it always does, but the damage had already been done. The charges were filed quickly. Liam Garrett, the older brother, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His younger brother Mark was charged as an accomplice, his confession laying bare the sequence of events that led to Jaden's death. There was no longer any doubt about what had happened. It was a premeditated crime done out of fear. Fear of being exposed for something darker they were doing in those woods. The violence of it all seemed too much, but the cold facts were there laid out clear as day. I thought about the moment Jaden's body was discovered, the way it had been wrapped, the rope tied around it so carefully. That wasn't something done in a fit of panic. That was methodical. That was deliberate. Even after the arrests, even after the case moved to court, it didn't feel like the town had found peace. There was a kind of exhaustion in the air, a weariness that came from knowing the worst had happened but not knowing what to do with it now. People went about their routines, but the small town's rhythm had changed. People stopped walking the trails as often. When you live in a place like Redding, where the forest is both your backyard and your escape, the woods become a place of safety, of quiet beauty. But after Jaden's death, the forest felt different. It felt like it was holding secrets it wasn't willing to share. Some families rebuilt in new ways, finding solace in each other. Alice, for one, found ways to keep moving forward, but there was always something missing, something that could never be filled. I saw it in her eyes every time I visited that vacancy that only loss can create. Her home had become a place of memories of things left undone of a son who would never come back. There were moments when the town seemed like it was healing, trying to move on. But for me, that quiet ache never really faded. I spent my days trying to focus on the small things, the light filtering through the trees in the morning, the sound of wind in the pines, small distractions that didn't work as well as I had hoped. And I'll admit there were nights when I found myself out in those woods walking the same trails trying to make sense of it all. But the woods didn't offer up any answers. It wasn't the place to find them. Years passed. The court case dragged on longer than anyone wanted it to. I still remember the day the trial ended. The Garrett brothers, once so familiar as part of the town's background, had become strangers in the worst way. There were guilty pleas convictions and sentences handed down. But the town's closure felt hollow. It wasn't closure. Nothing about what happened could ever be closed. It was like a crack in the world that would always be there no matter how many coats of paint you put over it. I often think about that first discovery, Jaden's body so carefully wrapped up like it was a secret to be hidden. I don't know if anyone could ever fully understand how something so cold, so final, could be done by someone who had walked those same trails, breathed that same air. What does it take to silence someone like that? How does someone who had grown up in the same place under the same sky do something like this? The answer to that still echoes in the quiet spaces of my mind. I'll never know, and maybe it's better that way. But there's something about the unanswered questions that stays with you, gnawing at the edges of your thoughts. Alice never fully recovered, and maybe that's something none of us could have expected. The loss of a child is a wound that never really heals. It changes the person you are. And the town, well, the town became quieter, a little more wary. The light in people's eyes was dimmed even if they didn't know why. It was as if the loss of one person had seeped into the bones of the place and left its mark. I still carry pieces of that day with me. The air in the ravine cold and still when the body was uncovered. The way the sunlight turned everything into long, heavy shadows as the truth settled in. And the way the quiet that followed felt like something was missing, like something we couldn't put back. The truth had come to light, but the weight of it never left. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel, so these stories are never forgotten.